I'm Jim May, a parent of two young kids attending Indiana public schools in Carmel, Indiana. Recently, there's been a lot of focus on some of the things being taught in our public schools, including several stories that have made the national media outlets. As a parent, a lot of what's come out has made me pretty mad. It should make you mad too. I've decided to make a series of short videos to talk about some of these bombshell reports. Hopefully, they'll help boost awareness among Hoosiers who don't currently have kids in the school systems. This first video is going to be the longest, so please bear with me. We need to lay some groundwork before we get started. Let's start by talking about how we arrived where we're at. A couple of years ago, a relatively small group of parents made a startling allegation. Many public schools across the nation were teaching kids to gamble. These parents started to organize, forming a small number of network groups across the country. These groups would show up at school board meetings to repeat the allegation and demand that their local schools remove gambling from their curriculum. Now, by and large, public school administrators ignored the movement. They knew that there was no mention of gambling in any of their grades' curricula. They assumed the complaints would quickly fade away. But unfortunately, several other groups saw the potential to exploit this movement for their own gain. Now, there's a lot of money in K through 12 education. And when I say a lot, we're talking about $800 billion per year spent on public schools in the U.S. Now, there are a lot of for-profit entities who would love to get their hands on some of those government funds. They proved willing to invest their own money in public relations campaigns and lobbyists to back the gambling in schools narrative. Additionally, many opportunistic political figures, both in the media and elected officials, also saw an opportunity. If they could convince their voters that schools were teaching gambling, then they could frame the issue as something that their party opposed and the other party supported. They saw it as a wedge issue that could potentially further their political careers by further dividing our communities. Now, with the backing of these wealthy and powerful groups, the anti-gambling parents movement quickly grew. They started pointing to school math textbooks that talked about odds and probabilities, claiming that these were code words for gambling. Political pundits amplified their voices and helped refine their messaging. We started hearing news reports that said things like, while learning about probabilities doesn't necessarily mean gambling, it's certainly a way teachers can sneak gambling into the classroom to indoctrinate children. Confused and under attack, many teachers and school administrators began avoiding using the term probabilities. Their math classes would still teach the same content, still completely unrelated to gambling, but instead of talking about probabilities, they would just say the chances of a specific outcome. The accusations continued to grow. Now, multiple state legislators announced that they had heard rumors of elementary school teachers setting up blackjack tables in the backs of their classrooms so kids could gamble with their allowance during recess. Now, in multiple state houses across the country, even though there's no evidence of this occurring even once, legislation was introduced to ban that practice. State lawmakers, often after receiving sizable donations from school choice lobbyists, introduced and passed legislation to establish or expand voucher programs. This directly transferred some of that $800 billion spent on public schools to for-profit private schools. A fourth grade teacher was featured in the national news for using dice to teach their kids about fractions. He was suspended for 2 days. When it was reported that a fifth grade teacher held a mock casino day with Monopoly money, members of the community picketed the school and she was fired from her job. Across the country, school board candidates ran on anti-gambling platforms with messaging developed by national organizations. They insisted that formal indoctrination began as early as second grade with talk of fractions. Lobbying organizations donated to their campaigns. Political figures amplified their voices. In many suburban districts, they won. Throughout all of this, teachers kept teaching the same math they'd always taught, but now they were jumping through hoops to avoid whatever word or words were added to the growing list of supposedly gambling-related terms. Now, it's worth noting nearly no parents seemed to object to the math that was actually being taught in the classroom, but teachers would get irate complaints about specific words being used. Administrators began proactively sharing their school's math curricula with their communities, hoping increased transparency would help diffuse the situation. They patiently responded to endless freedom of information requests, spending hours pulling copies of internal emails and lesson plans, often for people who had no kids in the schools, but were absolutely convinced that gambling was being taught somewhere in their community. A new tactic emerged whereby a national activist group would hire actors to pose as parents moving to a new school district. These actors would meet with a member of the school's administration and secretly film the meeting. They would voice a concern about whether or not their child would actually be able to learn math due to all the anti gambling propaganda. The administrators would explain that gambling had never been a part of the curriculum and that yes, math was still being taught, they just had to omit certain words to avoid controversy. The National Activist Group then edited together a video of short, out of context quotes from administrators. They released it as proof that these schools' administrators, behind parents' backs, were indoctrinating students with the principles of gambling. National political pundits amplified the story, as did local activist group and elected officials. That brings us pretty much up to date, except for one thing. As you've likely guessed, in the real world, the attacks haven't purported to be about gambling. That type of topic is too well known and understood by the majority of people to be an effective foundation for this type of propaganda. The groups attacking our schools needed to use terms that most people were unfamiliar with. So instead of gambling, we got critical race theory. Instead of probability, we have social emotional learning. Instead of attacking words like odds and fractions, they've gone after words like equity and inclusion. Knowing that many people aren't familiar with some or all of these terms or how they're used in education, the activist groups have stripped them of their meaning and applied new definitions that serve their interest. Other than changing out the topic that this movement's chosen to center on, everything I just have said is a generally accurate representation of what we've seen play out over the last several years. That includes using hidden camera videos to obtain footage of school administrators that's cut to pieces to create propaganda. We recently saw this happen to some of our school administrators here in Indiana. Actors met with them in pairs, claiming identities such as being gay parents, or parents of a gay or trans child, or parents concerned about the bullying of minority children. As this series progresses, there will be videos focusing on what each of those administrators did and didn't actually say when they were filmed, without consent and under false pretenses. Thanks for watching.